Hello, everyone. Welcome to our module on utilizing data in CLNA process. My name is Yasamin Khoshpour, and I'm a research assistant at OCCRL.
Hello, everyone. My name is Osley J. Flores. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and a faculty affiliate of OCCRL.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. So today we are going to have this module, which is based on a webinar that happened on February 5th of 2025 for our CLNA cohort on analyzing data for equity, understanding the different perspectives. We're going to dive deeper on the theory of organizational leadership. And I'm going to ask Dr. Flores to start the first section of our module.
And so, opening our discussions, one of the things that scholars have used to look at and analyze data in higher ed education has been this idea of organizational learning and basically applying an organizational learning to database decisions and discussions. And so one of the things that researchers argue is that organizational learning can help individuals understand the structural and cultural obstacles, right, that prevent institutions of higher ed to produce better outcomes. Basically, taking a lens, if looking at organizational learning, that makes things that are invisible visible and the things that are undiscussable discussable, right? And so, what is organizational learning theory? Basically, the scholars who suggest that organizational learning is basically just as individuals learn, so do organizations, right? Some individuals that work in organizations. So, one of the critical issues of organizational learning is that the process in which individuals learn translates to organizations. So it becomes transitions into a cultural thing, right? So as individuals learn, they also learn as an organization. So some of those issues and lenses and approaches that you take also become embedded as part of the organization, right? So individual learning becomes embedded in the organization's memory and structure. So when you think about how you look at data, right? Once the type of way and the approach that you look and the lens, the perspective that you look at the data is kind of informed by the whole organization. And we'll learn about what scholars argue are different kind of perspectives of looking at data. So basically, organizational practices grow from and mirror the shared cognitive frames of individuals. So this is understanding that once individuals are working within a system, they either adopt the organization structures that are currently in place, right, and how they approach their individual learning. Okay, so what is this idea of cognitive frames? But basically, cognitive frames are this is how individuals interpret situations, and then based on those interpretations, they devise your actions. So once you think about how you're framing a situation, it influences your action. What are you going to do, right? So also cognitive frames regulate your attitudes, beliefs, and values and actions. So think about how this influences what you do, your beliefs, right? Also, cognitive frames helps you understand a phenomena, what is taking place. So if you're looking at data and you're looking at enrollment data, like what basically, what are you understanding about the phenomena that those numbers are showing, right? So thinking about cognitive frames is your dispositions, your way of thinking, and how that thinking then it helps inform your way in thinking about action, right? So going from thinking to action, that's what cognitive frames is helpful to think about. Okay, so what we want to share with you in this webinar is this work by Bensema, who argues that she identified there's three cognitive frames, right? So she identified frames of diversity, deficit, and equity frames. right? So when you look at, and then based on these frames, remember, it's your disposition and thinking and how they influence your action. So when looking at these cognitive frames, they're matched up around, you see on the left-hand side, orientation, discourse, and strategy. So think about your thinking, like what that thinking, what conversations that thinking leads to, and what actions that thinking and discourse leads to, right? Your strategies, your actions. So if we take a look at and examine diversity cognitive frame, basically a diversity cognitive frame focuses, if when you're looking at the data, focuses on the representation of differences. So for example, you recognize the racial difference, the gender diversity, the diversity in sexual orientation, and so on of your student representation, your student body, right? So if you have a diversity cognitive frame, you're well aware that maybe your institution might be diverse or not diverse, right? Depending on your context. So based on that orientation, looking at the data, the discourse that a cognitive frame develops in your thinking and your beliefs is you celebrate diversity, you recognize cross-racial relationships, but you also hold colorblind perspective, right? And so one of the things and that's kind of the discourse. So in this cognitive and social benefit of having, so you just highlight, yes, we're diversity and which we should be, we're benefiting from that, right? But one of the things that if you have a diversity cognitive frame is the strategies that you try to work on to support students is you mostly do it at kind of surface level. You create, for example, workshops, sensitivity training, um, exposing whites to the other, diversifying the curriculum, but you're not really changing systems, right? So diversity, you recognize, you value, you highlight diversity, but it still holds some kind of colorblind approach, and the strategies that you implement are more surface level. Now let's take a look at the second column, which is the deficit cognitive frame column. If you have this kind of belief and disposition, basically you focus on when you're looking at the data, you focus on stereotypical characteristics associated with disadvantages and poverty. So you mostly focus when you look at the data, you blame the victim, right? And you're not able to look at look at what yourself or your system, the school system is doing to better support students. So you mostly focus on deficit thinking, right? And if you have this orientation, this belief, right, as you can imagine, the conversations, the discourse you have through this lens is, you know, you in trying an intervention that you create, you're mostly looking at, oh, like students don't have good study skills. Again, you're blaming the students and not interrogating the system, right? You blame students that don't have lack motivation, right? So you're mostly blaming the students. And the strategies you come up with, you consider some examples will be like remedial courses or special programs, right? But unfortunately, though, if you have this deficit cognitive frame, your programming, your interventions are mostly focused on fixing the student, not the system, right? Meanwhile, when we look at the last column, an equity cognitive frame, if you have an equity cognitive frame, right, the orientation you have is you focus on the institutional practices and the production that those causes for inequities, right? It's particularly for minority groups, right, or minoritized groups. So if you have an equity cognitive frame in that thinking, you interrogate yourself and the institution of what is it that may be leading to practices that are creating inequities, right? So if you have this orientation, the language and the discourse that you tend to have is basically you take responsibility, right? You as an institution and as an individual about student outcomes. So maybe there's underrepresentation, right? Or overrepresentation, or some students might not be performing well. When you look at that data, you take it upon yourself is like, what can we do as an institution to better support that? And that's the discourse that frames, right? And you're color conscious. Instead of colorblind, you're color conscious and you're aware of the racialized practices, right? And that are occurring in your institution. And with an equity cognitive frame, when you think about strategies, right? You with that in that within that cognitive frame, you're thinking about changing the institution, developing institutional accountability of equitable educational outcomes, and changing individual cognitive frames, either that your faculty who might have deficit thinking, right? So you work to challenge and change deficit thinking cognitive frames. So those are these are the three cognitive frames by Bensema. And so what we would like to do is now transition. Um, that. So what is this idea of deficit thinking, right? Deficit thinking, scholars have argued that deficit thinking is educators' tendency to locate the problem within students, families, and communities, right? Educators who harbor deficit thinking assume that certain students do not succeed in school because they're undermotivated, not disciplined, cognitively unprepared, or their parents neither value nor support their children's education. That is this idea of framing of deficit thinking. And then if we think about what we're asking you all to think about, how can you become more an equity-centered cognitive frame? An equity cent for us, we're going to argue that an equity-centered reforms and initiatives are foremost equity conscious, moving beyond simple awareness of inequities to acknowledge how specific institutional practices may contribute to these inequities. So think about what is it that we're doing? What are some things that we can change? What are some things that we can do to better support students, right? And kind of taking ownership of the inequities taking place in your school. And that's what when we push you to think about equity-centered cultures. And one of the biggest things that it takes for an equity-centered approach and cognitive frame is looking yourself in the mirror, right? And taking a look and interrogating yourself and thinking about what can I do. So one of the biggest things as educational leaders in your institution, the biggest thing to take when thinking about taking an equity-centered approach is looking yourself in the mirror and what is it that you want to be.
Thank you, Dr. Flores. Now, for this part of our module, we have two case studies, two hypothetical scenarios that we have uploaded on our website where you found this module. And I'm going to give you a brief review on these two case studies. Now, I hope you all have found the scenarios link and have downloaded the PDF file, which includes two scenarios. The first hypothetical scenario is happening at a community college which is located in a mostly rural area, and we have some information on the racial demographic distribution of students, the total population, enrollment data, graduation rates, and completion rate data. We have three characters here: the interim vice president of academic affairs, director of student success, and one faculty member. There's some data given and some conversation happening between the characters. We would like you to look at the prompt questions here and identify the cognitive frames in this scenario: the deficit thinking, diversity, and equity. How would you say each of these characters are behaving or talking, or what is the cognitive frame that you would interpret from their conversation? At the same time, think about your own experience at your own institution when reviewing the data, specifically disaggregated data. What have been your experience about these three cognitive frames? And moving forward to the third page of this PDF is our second case study, scenario number two. Again, another hypothetical scenario happening at a community college, which is in this case, it's in a metropolitan area. And again, we have information on the student population, demographics, and also some data on the specific programs offered and we have some data on US Bureau of Labor Statistics on the median pay for certain jobs related to what would be the outcomes of the programs in this institution. And we have two characters, the Dean of Research and the President of the college. They're talking about examining program enrollment with a focus on the overrepresentation and underrepresentation. So we would like you to look at the data presented in this scenario and answer these discussion questions which we have here. Take some time to reflect on this and we will continue with the rest of our module. Thank you everyone for reviewing our case studies and thinking about the questions. Again, these are only some case studies that we gave so that you can have a chance to reflect on what's going on in your own institutions and eventually take what you thought about today and whatever that you were able to think about today and what you learned. We hope that you can take this to your own institution and apply it at your own context. So thank you so much. And now I am going to end our module by saying that feel free to contact us. I am Yasemin Khoshpour and Dr. Flores. We were the facilitators of this module, and there are our other team members here on the slide with their contact information. Again, I hope you were able to take something away from today's module that can help you reflect and apply in the context of your own institution. Thank you, and see you later.